Good morning and welcome to the IGE DGB Financial Group International Conference towards a new financial horizon, challenges and opportunities for ESG and digital transformation. We would like to extend sincere thanks to our hosts, the Institute for Global Economics and DGB Financial Group for hosting today's conference. I'm Hannah John and I have the honor of being your MC for today. First, thank you to everyone who is joining us online and offline for this very special forum. For those who are joining us offline, I would like to remind you to keep your masks on while you are seated due to social distancing measures. As we have a very busy schedule today, I will do my best to keep us on time. To begin our conference, I would like to introduce our conference keynote speech by Ms. Krueger, Professor Emeritus at Stanford University. Ms. Krueger previously served as Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Vice President for Economics and Research at the World Bank, and was Founding Director of Stanford Center for Research on Economic Development. Directly after Ms. Krueger's keynote remarks, we will begin immediately with our first session for today. And to moderate our first session entitled Digital Innovation and the Future of the Financial Industry, we are delighted to have with us Ms. Henny Sender, Managing Director at BlackRock and Senior Advisor to the BlackRock Investment Institute. Ms. Henny Sender was also former Chief Correspondent for International Finance at the Financial Times based in Hong Kong. At this time, please turn your attention to the screen for Ms. Krueger's keynote remarks, followed directly by the first session for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It is a very great pleasure to be here, and I have been very honored to be invited to give a keynote address. And I've been asked to address the current state of the international economy and its prospects. That's an incredibly difficult topic to talk about it because we have more uncertainty now than any time I can remember, or any time even I know about in the history of the international economy. There's always uncertainty in economic activity. That's what it's about, in fact, because obviously you're doing something now for something in the future. You're either buying the wood now so you can make something with it later, or you're growing the tree to get the wood, or you're buying some inventory so that you can sell it to retailers. But there have been few times in economic history, I think, when uncertainty has been as great as it is now. There's uncertainty about so many things. So let me just talk about some of them very briefly, and I'm sure you'll go into detail on them later on in the conference. But in any event, the first one, obviously, is the uncertainty about COVID. And the uncertainty is really a question, first of all, how COVID itself will do, how long it will take to peter out, as it seems to be doing. But in addition to that, there's a question of whether there will be a mutation and another strain of the virus, which is lethal or less lethal or more lethal than the current one. And we just don't know. One of the big questions is, can we get the vaccination going fast enough, and can we get enough testing going so that indeed there won't be another big upsurge of the virus? If that happens, then all bets are off. But we don't know what will happen to the economy because we don't know what will happen otherwise to many, many other things. So I'm going to assume for my talk that particular uncertainty gets resolved in a way that the virus will not mutate and that we can go on recovering and that we're in the recovery phase. But please bear in mind that the virologists are scared, and rightly so, that we might see another mutation. So my remarks do have an optimistic slant to them, and please remember that they are all subject to basically the virus not mutating to something more lethal again. Now, even if that doesn't happen, there are a lot of uncertainties because of the pandemic as to what's going to happen next. To what extent will nations take measures to reduce the spread of the virus? Are we likely to see pockets with large numbers of unvaccinated people who could make mutation more likely? If the cases drop and become milder, then the economic questions begin, and there are a lot of them. First off, we just have never been in a situation like this before, where the downturn in economic activity became about because of a health problem. Obviously, it happened in medieval times, it happened in the Spanish flu, but not one in the modern economy where the interconnections are so intricate and where things are as difficult to change as they are right now. Now, it's, I think, obvious to most people that in most advanced countries right now, what has happened as this pandemic has gone over its peak is that demand has grown quickly, while supply has grown much more slowly, if at all. And of course, when that happens, economists will tell you when there's excess demand, that puts pressure on supplies and that puts upward pressure on prices, but we'll come back to that. Let me start with demand. During the pandemic's peak, when everybody was under lockdown in their houses and so on, households reduced their consumption much more than their income during the acute phase of the pandemic. People just couldn't spend as much on travel, restaurant meals, leisure activities like going to the theater or sporting events. And so what happened is many households have better cash balances now than they've had in a long time. It's thought that maybe the American households have a higher ratio of assets to liabilities that they've had in a very many years, if ever. It is really quite startling how much savings were built up there because there was nothing to spend. It was even more true in the countries with generous benefits to the unemployed, and that includes the United States. In this country, for example, the benefits for many unemployed workers meant that household incomes rose by 30% while consumption fell. So 2020 was a year in which actually incomes rose, even though output fell. When the numbers of the strict ill began to fall, demand rose sharply because people had accumulated a lot of desire to do those things, to travel, to go to restaurants, all that sort of thing. And of course, at first, the restaurants had closed, they weren't open, the theaters weren't open, and so it took a while for economic activity to resume. And on the supply side, the restaurants, the theaters, and so on couldn't move that fast. In part, this was because some service and manufacturing activities had just closed down, they'd gone bankrupt, and they can't come back. So some restaurants are just gone. But in part, it was because it takes time to restart a business, to get your workers, and that sort of thing. But on top of those phenomena, which in itself led people to think there would be inflation, bottlenecks arose, and there's a shortage of workers, at least in the United States and in some of the other advanced countries. Increased output, then increased demand for ocean and landborne shipping, but the number of truckers, ships, freight forwarders, and others used to transport things who did not return to work as quickly as they might have, and they did not enable as rapid an increase in supplies to the point of delivery where consumers wanted them. At the present time, and in the United States it's huge, we have significant bottlenecks in congested ports, factories awaiting raw materials, and much more. Compounding that phenomenon is that there seem to be many people who just aren't ready to come back to work. We have more job vacancies relative to unemployed now than we've ever had in the United States since we kept those records. A major uncertainty is, of course, how long the supply bottlenecks will last and how much they will dent economic activity. People cannot manufacture things until the raw materials come. Parts and components have to get there before the finished good can be produced. And there are major bottlenecks at all steps along the way. I ordered some windows last February, was told they'd be in May. I'm now told they are on a ship somewhere in the Pacific, that they don't know when the ship will get to port. They don't know when from port it will get into dock. It will be unloaded because the port is so congested and the trucks are jamming the ports. And then they have to find trucks to bring the windows into the wholesalers, and that will take more time. And if I ask when my windows will come, they say they just don't know. They have no idea. They don't even know where they are. And I'm not untypical. Yesterday, someone else told me about their windows, and their wait wasn't as long as mine has already been. It's all over the place. Now that increased output, of course, was a good thing until it got all jammed up. But basically what has happened since then is we have significant bottlenecks in the ports. Factories are waiting for raw materials. The producers who use those raw materials are waiting for their parts and components. And many activities are slowed down, so the increase in industrial production doesn't tell you what they would have liked to have done. It tells you what they could do given what they had by way of inventory that came into them. A major uncertainty, therefore, is how long the supply bottlenecks will last and how much they will dent economic activity in the meantime. So far, at least in most advanced countries, economic activity has been rising fairly rapidly, but there are some signs beginning to show that the lack of supplies, the lack of materials is in fact making things harder and making it more likely that we will not get the expansion of output continuing the way we had hoped. Another question that we just don't know the answer to is why so many are staying out of work. At first, they said it was because of the extra benefits, but in the United States, those stopped, and it doesn't seem to have made very much difference, a little bit, but not a lot. Some other people think that what's happening is workers are now looking for better jobs because they've been out of work and they think they'll go find something. And again, there's some truth to that. It's also true that the United States people, like most advanced countries, including Korea, are aging. And so there are few people dropping out of the labor force and the labor force is falling. But even all of those factors do not quite explain why we have such a shortage of labor as we do at the present time. So in the world trying to recover post the peak of the pandemic, there are great uncertainties as to how quickly supplies can increase, both because of bottlenecks and because of the apparent reluctance of those whose jobs were lost and they don't want to return to work. It's likely, therefore, that we're most likely going to see a continuing period where demand increases more rapidly than supply, or at least demand is greater than supply. And that itself is, of course, inflationary, at least in the short run. But the most advanced economies, especially the United States, on top of that, have adopted fiscal and monetary policies that are expansionary. That increases inflationary pressure still further. Even now, in the US, where the 12-month inflation rate is already 5% and rising, which is the highest in, I think, 22 years, and the US fiscal deficit for the last fiscal year was over 13% of GDP, which is the highest it's been forever. The Biden administration is seeking authorization for further spending increases, and the major central banks have not yet begun to pull back quantitative easing, which of course is increasing the money supply. So both of those are going to add to the inflationary stimulus at this time. So a major uncertainty is whether the excess demand currently being experienced and the inflation accompanying it can be reduced by supply increases, or whether the inflationary pressures and expectation that they will come before that happens. If that happens and people begin to expect inflation, then the next question of uncertainty is whether monetary and fiscal authorities will be able to dampen excess demand sufficiently to slow the inflation, but at the same time not spur a recession. And that's very hard to do. It takes a very delicate balance to achieve, and probably would even take some good luck on top of that, even if they had more information than they have about why people are behaving as they are. But as if those uncertainties weren't enough, we have many more key issues. A first is the probable evolution of the international economy. As you know, the Trump administration in the US became much more protectionist than the United States had been historically. To date, the Biden administration has failed to reverse those measures as much as many, including myself, had hoped. The World Trade Organization is vitally important for all of us, and it is sufficiently impaired by the Trump moves that questions arise as to how it can function effectively with all the new issues such as e-commerce and intellectual property rights and protocols for trade and services, which are increasingly important for 21st century trade, and how the nations get together and revive the WTO and strengthen it is one of the uncertainties and one of the important questions. But equally important are questions surrounding the emergence of China and China-US rivalry and China-US trade and finance, because that affects the whole world. A world with two large dominant trading powers has never really existed before the way it does now. The US and Russia had a Cold War, but Russia basically had opted out of the international system. Certainly, China has not done that. So we have the questions there. On the trade side, the issues are pretty clear. But on the finance side, there are lots of things. One of them right now is, of course, the issue of Everglade, and it's just symbolic. Its financial standing has made headlines in recent days, and for good reason. Its outstanding debt indebtedness is huge, and there are questions as to whether it can be rescued by the Chinese government and whether it will be rescued by the Chinese government, or whether instead its failure could dangerously impact international financial markets. So far, and I'm including the Great Recession and everything else, the Chinese have been successful in managing issues of solvency and managing their banking system, and it's likely that they'll do so again. Nonetheless, it is evident that the international financial system is not as well grounded as it might have been, or as might have thought in the past decades. There is a problem there. Moreover, There are many questions as to the macroeconomic and financial sustainability of many developing countries. Many have relatively high debt to GDP ratios, but are able to carry on because of low interest rates. If the advanced countries' interest rates rise sharply, or even just rise a lot, in efforts to thwart inflationary pressures, the impact on some emerging markets and their sovereign debt in the developing countries may be substantial. Some have been able to borrow in their own currency, which makes them less vulnerable, but others have increased their foreign currency denominated liabilities. There is certainly uncertainty as to how well they can manage their post-pandemic finances and avoid debt difficulties. And if they cannot do so, and if we have a lot of debt difficulties in developing countries, that too will slow down world growth. As if that is all that I've had to say so far, and I've had to discuss it very quickly, were not enough, there are finally some other very important uncertainties as to the future. Certainly, the world is aware of concerns about environment, carbon emissions, and much more. But addressing those issues will entail significant changes, especially in the vital energy sectors of all economies. The longer the delay continues before these issues are firmly addressed, the greater will be the disruption when the world finally faces reality and has to contain carbon emissions and the other things that we talk about so frequently when we're discussing the environment and its dangers. We are going to face problems. That seems to be reasonably clear to almost everybody now. And the question is, do we face them sooner, in which case the cost of adjustment will be there, but manageable? Or do we wait until it's a crisis situation, whereupon we have another situation in which all of us have to act on an emergency basis and the pain is much greater? Now, many of the uncertainties I have discussed are on the downside, especially if the national authorities do not respond wisely in a timely fashion. There is, however, an upside. The pandemic should have shown all of us how interdependent we are and the need for coordination and cooperation in economic and other policies. The pandemic, as well as environmental issues, both demonstrate that we must work together. We are all in the same world, and it should underline the world's need for well-functioning and effective international organizations. If all of that happens, then we could be in much better shape. And it's hoped that the hardships of the pandemic, the challenges we now face with inflation and supply bottlenecks, and the needs for addressing environmental issues will result in greater recognition, the extent to which we are all in this together, and we must all together agree and make sacrifices for the common good that will benefit us all. If multilateral cooperation is strengthened as a result of the shocks and the difficulties we're now having, the international economy will be better prepared for the future challenges it may meet, and growth can become more sustainable in the future. Thank you very much.